Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox Recording here to share with you 5 mixing mistakes to avoid in your home studio. Now, I've been doing this for well over a decade, and I see people make the same 5 mistakes over and over and over and over again. And also, I've been guilty of all of these myself. So because of that, I've decided to put this video together to showcase the 5 most common mixing mistakes that I always see so you can avoid making them. Common mixing mistake number 1, using way too many plugins. Now, because in our DAWs, we can load up as many plugins as we want, as many EQs, compressors, delays, reverb, saturators as we want, we often go crazy with it, and this is not a good thing. Now, a lot of times, many of us are fans of classic albums that were made before DAWs even existed. And when you think of this logically, back then, they did not have access to all of the tools that we have now. When you mixed on an analog console and had a rack of outboard gear behind you, you only had a handful of tools or a handful of processes that you could apply to each of your individual tracks. And because of this, many pros approach mixing within their DAWs in the same fashion. In other words, they use a handful of plugins and really stick to those plugins. For example, I use maybe 3 different EQs, 3 or 4 different compressors, 2 different reverbs, not 100 different reverbs, not 200 different compressors, because it's very easy to fall down that rabbit hole. And at the end of the day, yes, a different compressor will have a slightly different vibe and character, but it's not gonna make or break your mix. You are the one that's responsible for making or break your mix and the techniques that you use while you're mixing. The other issue is that people often will audition a bunch of different plugins on a particular source sound that they're working on. Because we have access to so many different plugins, even the free ones that come with your DAW, doesn't mean you have to audition every single EQ plugin on your guitar track. It's gonna do nothing but slow you down. Believe me, you'll be much better off if you use only a handful of plugins and learn those plugins inside and out. This is why most of the plugins that I use, I've been using for well over a decade, because I know them inside and out. I know them well. I know how they react on different sources. Now, I'm not saying that you should never buy new plugins or never try new plugins. What I'm saying is to not get caught in that trap, because many of us do. And it's not only a never-ending money pit, it's also an endless waste of time. So with that being said, let's bring on a common mixing mistake number 2, over EQing your tracks before achieving a decent balance in your mix. Now, because so many of us are working within the digital domain and often EQ is a visual thing these days, we often get into the habit of applying arbitrary EQ settings to tracks that we're not even really listening to. So in other words, we might go in and add a crazy curve to our kick drum, or really EQ our guitars, go crazy EQing our vocals, whatever, when we should really be dialing in a decent balance first. Now, what I prefer to do is to add high-pass filters to all of my individual tracks in a gentle way. So for example, I know I'm not gonna want anything below 100 Hertz on my vocal track. I'll do that for all of my individual tracks. Then I'll dial in a decent rough mix. I'm not going crazy cutting a bunch of mid-range on my kick drum. I'm not boosting a bunch of top end on my vocal. That all comes later. I wanna hear the song in its rawest state possible, so I know that my balance is in the best place possible before I go carving out or adding any additional frequencies. And one of the most common mixing mistakes that I see people make is over EQing their tracks before they achieve a decent balance. And I was one of the worst offenders of this when I started out. And this brings me to common mixing mistake number 3. Not using enough automation in your mix. Now, people love talking about EQ, compression, fancy plugins, outboard gear, all the fun stuff, but no one ever wants to apply automation to their mix. And I have news for you. All great mixers use a ton of automation. In my opinion, it is one of the most underrated mixing techniques under the sun. And this is because it's just not a sexy topic. Who finds drawing in automation fun in a DAW? Now, over time, I've grown to really love the technique because I know just how powerful it is, but most beginners don't even think to utilize this technique. Automating your rhythm guitars, your drums, your master bus, you can add a ton of life and character to your mix with volume automation alone. This is why when you see guys working on analog consoles, they're always working the faders. They're playing that console almost like it's an instrument. And this is what automation will do to your mix. So believe me, do not skip out on automation. It's one of the most underrated and powerful mixing techniques in existence. And this leads me to common mixing mistake number 4, listening to instruments in solo way too much. I see people do this all of the time, and again, I was guilty of it myself. I have news for you. What your guitars sound like at solo does not matter. What your drums sound like at solo doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, any of your instruments within your mix, how they sound in solo does not matter. It's irrelevant. It's what your mix sounds like as a whole. Remember, it's called mixing for a reason. Now, if you've ever watched a pro mixer work, they're mixing pretty quickly and they're rarely checking things in solo. The only time I'll really solo an instrument is if I hear an issue and I need to surgically remove something. Other than that, I'm mixing with everything in context because that's how the mix is going to be heard anyway. And most pros do the exact same thing. Now, I'm not saying to never listen to your instruments in solo, but believe me, do not get caught in this trap. The reality is that whatever your guitars sound like in solo does not matter. Okay, and this brings me to common mixing mistake number 5, and this applies to DAWs. Not setting your DAW up as if it were an analog console. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, whenever people send me their sessions to mix, I'm often astounded at just how disastrous they are. Tracks all over the place, effects at the beginning of the session, effects at the end of the session, just things not properly organized. And one thing I highly recommend is organizing your session as if it were an analog console. In other words, having your tracks always in the same order, properly labeled, preferably color-coded, and having all of your sound effects sitting at the end of your session. And also, using sound effects saves a lot of CPU. So for example, instead of loading a reverb on your individual tracks, use 1 or 2 reverbs and send specific tracks to that same reverb. This is how it's done on an analog console, and I follow the exact same approach even within my DAW. Again, it's not only quick and efficient, but it saves on CPU. If you ever watch a pro mix on an analog console, the console is always nice and organized. They often have a piece of tape laid out across the console with each track clearly labeled. And this mentality often gets lost when we're working within a DAW because we can have anything laid out in any which way. And in my opinion, this isn't a good thing. It often slows us down and isn't the most efficient way to run sessions within our computer anyway. So with that being said, try treating your DAW more like it's an analog console. You'll definitely grow to love it over time. So there you have it. Those are the top 5 common mixing mistakes that I see people make over and over and over again. And again, I've been guilty of all of them myself. And I'm curious to know, are you guilty of any of these yourself? Leave a comment in the comment section below and tell me all about it. I'd love to hear your opinion. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And be sure to download my 5-step guide to better heavy mixes. I want you to achieve better results with the gear you have right now, and this free guide will help point you in the right direction. Again, there's a link to the guide right below in this video's description. Till next time, happy mixing.